and welcome to episode 36 of Logicast, the AWS News podcast brought to you by Logicata. I'm Carl Robinson, CEO and co-founder of Logicata, and I'm joined today by my colleague, John Goodall. How are you doing today, John?
I'm ill.
Well,
That's
I passed
how
the
I am.
baton.
I'm ill.
Yeah, I'm glad that we have established that COVID cannot be transmitted via the internet, because I was ill last week with COVID. You're ill this week, but it's not COVID, so we've definitely not transmitted the virus over the wire.
Yeah, that would be really concerning, wouldn't it?
Yes, that COVID is now more than airborne; it's actually internet-borne as well. That would be, that would be rather worrying. But I'm sure there's a lot of virus in my shed, all over my monitor and my pop filter and things like that. But thankfully, you won't be going anywhere near any of that, so I'm sure you'll be fine. So, do you think you're going to be able to make half an hour? You made half an hour without swearing.
Plugs, am I? Half an hour without coughing.
That's what I was going to ask. Yeah, can you do half an hour without coughing? And he's muting to cough now.
No, I
so
can't.
The answer to that question is no. So let's see if he can manage 29 minutes without coughing. But we're not here to talk about our respective health. As you'll know, if you listen to the podcast every week, I collate a list of AWS news, which I share via my weekly AWS News Roundup newsletter. And then John and I pick a selection of articles that we would like to take a little bit of a deeper dive on in the Logicast podcast. So we've got such a selection of articles this week. So let's dive straight in. And the first one has been reminding me of one of the soundtrack songs from Top Gun, the first Top Gun movie, and it's DataZone. You're probably wondering why, but I just got Highway to the Danger Zone in my head when they're thinking about DataZone. So here we are with the Highway to the Data Zone. AWS have launched DataZone into general availability. Of course, it was announced at reInvent last year in preview, and they've managed to get it into GA before the next reInvent, which is always good. So, John, what can you tell us about DataZone? How is DataZone going to help customers with their data?
I think it's showing your age primarily.
From Highway to the Data Zone. But I'm sure everyone has watched the old Top Gun movie because the new Top Gun movie came out this year, was it? Or last year? I think maybe last year. So I'm sure everyone had to watch it, and I'm sure everyone still loves Highway to the Danger Zone or the Data Zone.
Interesting. So DataZone, so released into preview last year. It was mentioned in the various summit keynotes this year as well, presumably just to kind of keep the focus on it and to be able to talk about something that wasn't generative AI, because that was just the primary focus. But let's talk about something that isn't Gen AI. Let's talk about data, because, serverless and servers are dull. So let's talk about something else. It's still plenty of press coverage between last year and now, just because it kind of keeps doing the cycles every so often. Right, what is it? Well, there's 4 bits. There is the data portal, which lives outside of the AWS Management Console, much like Amplify as well, that lives outside the console. So this is one of those cool little services that you can give your data analysts access to without them having access to AWS proper, which is great because you don't want your data analysts in the same place that servers are provisioned or firewalls are looked after and those sorts of things. And it also makes your life doing permissions a lot easier because the number of people that are going to need access to Data Portal is probably quite a lot lower. It might be quite a lot higher, but it's a different set of people that's going to need access to AWS proper. So that's good. It's nice. And you don't have to go and explain the somewhat unintuitive AWS console. It's go there. Great. We like that. What that's doing is it's still authenticating with IAM, but it's going through a different route. That's the view. That's how you interact with it. It has a business data catalog, which is very much what it says on the tin. It's here's all the data in your business. It's cataloged. Brilliant. You probably have to do quite a lot to do that yourself, but that's kind of there. There's data projects and different environments, so you can work on, much like any other software development project. Data projects will need test environments and dev environments and kind of all the rest of it, which is fine. And then governance and access control and managing permissions to the underlying data stores like Lake Formation, like Redshift, like whatever. So that's kind of what it is and how it does it. It's a way of interacting with your data as a business from across your entire AWS estate in a platform and a portal that lives in AWS, but you can access it from outside of AWS. Lovely. Excellent. I did think the interface looked quite a lot like the Athena query interface. I've been using that a lot lately, so it's kind of on the brain. You look at it and they've taken some design cues from the Athena interface there because, I mean, it's doing fundamentally the same thing. You're writing SQL queries, so it kind of makes sense that they've just used that same interface. But yeah, I mean, I'm not a data guy, so it's just one of those. This is GA, and we should talk about it being GA. But if you do quite a lot in the data space as a business, which I imagine more businesses should be than are, if we're realistic about this, because lots of businesses, retail, hospitality, and all the rest of it, will have this sort of data, and maybe they're not doing anything with it because they're just focused on the day-to-day grind of getting the job done. But if you have data that you need to be interacting with and making decisions on, then this is another tool that you can use to do that. I'm not sure, however, that this solves, and I'm pinching an opinion here, but I'm not sure that this solves a problem that actually existed, because this has only been in GA for days and it's only in preview for a little under a year. But people that have had this need forever. So they will have been using other tools to do this. They will have been using, I don't know, Tableau or QuickSight or Microsoft Business Central or Power BI or whichever one it is, those sorts of things. They will have been using external tools to get the job done. So is this a case, I think, of AWS going, as they do occasionally, here's a need that our customers have that we're not meeting. We should build a tool to meet that need directly so that they're not spending money somewhere else.
Very possibly. Very possibly. Rather unusually as well for a GA announcement, it does actually go on to give you a step-by-step guide. That would normally be a separate blog post, but this post does actually go on to give you a step-by-step guide on how to set yourself up on DataZone, creating a domain, and so on and so forth. So if you are listening and do want to give it a go, check out the post. The link will be in the show notes, and there is a step-by-step guide with screenshots to walk you through setting up your first DataZone project. So that was the highway to the data zone. Let's segue into our next article, which is all about building arches. If you look at the picture, some lovely arches. I don't know where they are. They look like they're perhaps in Italy or somewhere where architecture is somewhat more grandiose than it is in the UK.
You mean you don't like old Victorian viaducts?
Yeah, I knew that might be a debatable point. I guess it depends on one's personal preferences. But
what about the aqueduct? Okay, now I'm showing my age, but there we go.
Funnily enough, I think it must be an age-related algorithm on Facebook, because I'm seeing lots of pictures of longboats at the moment, and I did see narrowboats, not longboats, completely different thing.
So longboats is the Viking thing.
Yes, indeed. No, I'm talking about canal boats, basically, and I do get some lovely aqueducts and things like that appearing in my Facebook feed for some reason. I've no idea why, but this has got nothing to do with Vikings or canal boats. This is or arches. In fact, it just happens to have arch in the title, and perhaps the image was selected by generative AI, because in this particular article, arch is just an abbreviation for architecture. So it's an article on the New Stack, which is the Insider's Guide to Building a Multi-Arch, read multi-architecture infrastructure. And what it's actually talking about is building apps that will run on different CPU architectures, as I understand it from my quick scan of reading it. And it's by Cheryl Hung, who of course works for ARM, who are a manufacturer of CPUs. Other CPU manufacturers.
No, they're not.
They're okay. Go on then. They are a
provider of
CPU
reference
architecture.
designs. Basically, they don't actually make anything. They provide reference designs for other people to make. So people like AWS make. This is why you've got loads of people making their own silicon on ARM, because ARM license the designs, as I understand it. They don't make anything.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that for me. But tell us a bit more about it then. Anyway, the point was the article was by Cheryl Hung, who works for ARM. But it's the article, as I understand it, is about building apps that will run on ARM and x86 infrastructure.
Well, yes and no. It's not building apps that will run on both. It's looking at whether, and that is part of it, but it's looking at migrating your infrastructure from x86 to ARM for the aforementioned, price performance that AWS love to bang on about. So, I mean, it's a fairly long article. It's very well written. It's long, so you're in for a good minute there.
Is it as long as your arm?
But
Sorry,
we need to get sound effects on this because that was great.
I didn't even prepare that one in advance.
No, I can tell. But yeah, it talks about, why you'd want to do it. It's price to performance, which is the first one. And we've said this a lot as well on previous like ARM announcements and things when Graviton's got a third version come out and what have you. That's kind of always the touted benefit is ARM largely runs cheaper and largely performs better. So those things aren't always true depending on the workload, but your price to performance ratio gets significantly better. It's like 50% better than equivalent x86 hardware because just how the system's set up, which is great. And then it talks about why you'd want to have the option to run on both. So this is the choice, this is the flexibility, because it's very much a meet your customers where they are. Depending on your app, it might not always be appropriate, but meet your customers where they are. And then there's, how you go about migrating it and things that you need to consider, because it's not just where you're running your app, it's how you're building your app, where you're building your app and those sorts of things. And then there's a process. It's, it's inform and optimize and go around in that circle. So you inform, you optimize, you operate, you inform, you optimize, you operate, and you go around and round and round and round and round. And then obviously they do a couple of case studies, which is kind of why it's such a long article. And then they say that, oh, we've done it ourselves. We are, eating our own dog food, which you kind of expect them to do. But yeah, it's an interesting one. It's definitely something that I've not run multi-architecture applications before, but I've run multi-architecture environments before. So this is more microservices based, but where you'd have like a chain of lambdas doing something or a step function that's calling a bunch of lambdas where 80 or 90% of them is running on ARM, and then the odd one is still running on x86 because it's either cheaper or there wasn't a dependency that worked on ARM or something of that nature. So it's something I have a little bit of experience with, and it's definitely worth sort of considering, primarily from my perspective, from the cost and performance reasons. Not so much the flexibility, but then, my bias is back end. Like I don't care where the customers are. They're coming to me back end.
Cool. Nice little soundbite in here from Danilo Puccia at AWS that 48 of the top 50 Amazon EC2 customers use Graviton processors for their workloads. I would imagine that's not exclusively. I would imagine they are using a mixture of x86 and ARM-based Graviton. But that's a pretty decent adoption there. 48 of the top 50 customers already using it.
Yeah, it's not a small number, and I don't see that changing realistically, because if you look at Graviton 1 versus equivalent x86, it was 30-40% better. Graviton 2 versus 1, it was 20 or 30% better than Graviton 1. It just kind of keeps going. So there's no logical reason not to at least investigate using ARM. The article as well does talk about Kubernetes, because you read an article about ARM, you've got to talk about Kubernetes. It's like bad juju not to talk about Kubernetes.
What does it say about Kubernetes?
It's almost mentioned in passing. It doesn't really go into great detail, but it talks about, here's your retail application or whatever it was, and your Kubernetes thing that's running your retail application, which in our experience, largely they're not running on Kubernetes, they're running on EC2 largely, but that's by the by. And then, you can upload your control, you can update your control plane ahead of updating your nodes so that you've got some of the benefits of running it a little bit cheaper, a little bit more cost effectively or whatever, without having to completely re-architect your system to take advantage of it. So yeah, that's a thing, because Kubernetes being what it is, it makes everything more complicated just to, validate its existence.
And there is a wonderful subheading towards the end of the article: dog fooding ARM on ARM, which is obviously about ARM eating their own dog food and having migrated most of their own or a lot of their own infrastructure onto ARM-based CPUs in the cloud. But I just thought it was worth reading that one out. Dog fooding ARM on ARM. It's a lovely bit of prose there. So anyway, let's move on from arches into Bedrock. And I know how much you love talking about AI, John, because everybody's talking about AI. You chose this article, so we're going to have to talk about AI. AWS are throwing money at AI at the moment. Obviously, there's a huge land grab going on in the generative AI space. Some say AWS playing catch up to Microsoft, etc., with the whole ChatGPT and investment in open AI. But certainly I know from personal experience, there's a lot of credits being made available to AWS customers at the moment for anybody that wants to try anything to do with generative AI. But obviously we mentioned on the podcast recently that Bedrock has recently been launched into general availability. But this particular article is on ZDNet. And it just asks the question, what is Amazon Bedrock? And offers 4 ways it can help businesses to use generative AI tools. So let's shed a bit more light on it, John. What is Amazon Bedrock?
I'm just going to take a little bit of exception to your pronunciation there. It's ZDNet because it's an American website.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Bedrock. It's quite difficult to mispronounce Bedrock. But yeah, I've never heard it called ZDNet, actually, but I suppose that is how Americans would say it. I've just never heard anyone say it out loud. So yeah, but
That's
we
very
are an
much an
international.
issue.
We're an
That is very
international podcast, so let's call it ZDNet.
I mean, that's very much a problem, right? If you've only ever seen a word written down.
Yeah. How do you know how to pronounce it? Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, Carl's pronunciation aside, what is it? Well, it's AI as a service. It's generative AI as a service, which is great because AWS have had a bit of a history, and I think saying that they're playing catch up is unfair because they've been playing in the AI space forever, like for ages. I think they're playing catch up on this one in the media cycle and only in the media cycle, because the fact that they were talking about it, back in May or whenever it was, and then went limited preview kind of in the summer, and now they've gone GA now. They've been working on this for ages. So I think they're only playing catch up in the media cycle, which is probably why the original announcements way back felt a bit half baked because it was, we've got to put something out to talk about it. And now this is kind of what it's going to look like. So this is going to generate a lot of media cycles for a little while just because of the nature of the beast. But right, so it is AI, generative AI more specifically, as a service. Great. There is an endpoint. I'm very annoyed I didn't get to see the demos at London AWS on Tour events because it hadn't gone GA just yet. So if you went to the event in Barcelona or in Lyon, I'm very jealous of you. I'm very jealous because you could get a proper demo and I couldn't. It's just unfair. So yeah, that's what it is. And the article is kind of talking about what's the business benefit as opposed to what it is, and they're reasonably informed opinions. I think it's democratizing AI because you don't have to have these giant GPU farms and server farms and racks and racks and racks of kit to train your models to get some sort of business benefit out of an LLM or generative AI more generally, because they've kind of done that. You just use it. Brilliant. Which is also kind of the benefit of their other AI as an API, if you like recognition and what have you. You just kind of use it. Yeah, the price itself isn't massively cheap at hyperscale because you pay per 1,000 and it's like a couple of bucks per 1,000 or something for recognition. And this is likely to be similarly priced. So it's not cheap at really high scale, but for people just kind of getting into it, playing with it, using it, working out how they can kind of make it work for their business, the pricing is good enough that you can experiment without breaking the bank and having to buy big GPUs and hire engineers and kind of all the rest of it. So that's good. We like that. The next one, cost effectiveness, time is money. So in addition to obviously having big, powerful kit, be that either ARM processors or graphics cards more traditionally, which actually run ARM processors, shockingly, to train your LLMs, you don't need to do that because they've kind of already done it, because there's 2 elements of that. There's paying for it, and then there's the time taken to train the model. This model took X amount of hours or days to train. You haven't had to spend that time sitting there with it going through all of the various bits of training data, learning the training data. I mean, you find this in the deep racer leagues and things. Is that how much time did you spend training your model? 9 hours, 12 hours, and that's just for a little piddly racing car that goes around a track. Right? And that's 2 business days realistically of training time. That's if you want to be able to get actual business benefit rapidly, you don't have the time to spend doing that, which is why AI as a service is quite so powerful as it can be. And also things like ChatGPT, it's AI as a service. It's kind of come to the fore because the freebie version that's open to the public is, is pretty good. And the next one is making it easy to customize your AI. So they have their baseline models that you can then build on top of. So you don't have to use their baseline model, but you can kind of take that model and then do your own training on top of that. It's not training, I think they call it. I think there's another word for it. It's refining or something of that nature. So again, it's one of those, they've done the hard work. You can then refine the model based on your supplementary data. So you haven't had to go through all the pain of getting the baseline in, and you can just kind of tweak it towards the end, which is great. And then speed to market, because again, it's already kind of there and it's done. It's kind of three things talking about how long these things take to do anything and become useful, because it can be weeks to train these things properly. And I suspect Bedrock has been months of training,
if not years. The models that are behind it, yeah. So cool. Okay, well, I'm conscious of time, so let's skip on from Bedrock, and I hope that you get to see your demo sometime soon, John. I'm sure there'll be a video or a reInvent session that you can stream on Bedrock to get up to speed.
I did see a session come through on the community builder thing. That'll be NDA'd probably, but it's a GA service, so I'm not sure. But I'll probably go to that.
Cool. Well, I'll look forward to hearing your feedback once you've been. So let's move on to, I think, my favorite headline for this week is our friends at Elder Edge. Always good for a comedy IT news headline. This one, I'll read it out word for word. AWS stirs the MadPot, busting bot baddies and Eastern espionage. Brilliant. I mean, you just have to read the article just to understand what the hell's going on, because there's enough to unpack in the headline alone, let alone the article itself.
It's almost like it's been written by a Gen Z, because they're talking about spilling the tea. Like, that's really super modern slang, that. And honestly, in the UK, spilling your tea is a crime.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, this article is all about the unveiling of MadPot, which was a previously secret threat intelligence tool used by AWS as a honeypot, I guess, to attract cyber criminals. So tell us a bit more about this one, John.
So traditional format, let's do a little bit of definition first. A honeypot it's like an obvious target. If it's kind of what it says on the tin, which is a bit weird for security tooling, but it's kind of like what it says on the tin. If you put a big pot of honey being the obvious example, but it could be sugar water or a donut or whatever, out in the middle of the field, all the insects in creation are going to go over there and not come and nick your sandwiches because you're having a very depressing picnic out of a lunchbox because you're poor. Okay, now I'm just projecting. But that's kind of the idea, right? You put, and it's like those insect catchers and things that you see as well. They've got like a bit of orange juice or whatever in them. You've put it something somewhere else for the insects to go to. And this is the same sort of concept for bots and cyber traffic and all the rest of it that you kind of don't want get into your applications. You make a nice big obvious prize over here and they go over there and your honeypot just kind of swallows it and eats them. Brilliant. And then because all the traffic's going that way, it's not really affecting anything else, and it's a great way of just completely subsuming an entire botnet. The probably most prominent example that I can think of would have been WannaCry, I want to say, that thing that ripped through the NHS because they're on knackered old versions of Windows. And one security researcher, Malwarebytes, Marcus Hutchins, who also had lots of trouble with the police and the FBI and various other things. Definitely go and look him up because he's a very funny guy. And yeah, hell of a story there. But he worked out what was going on with it, and it was calling out to a server, and he just registered a domain, and all the traffic went over there instead. Brilliant. So it just stopped it dead. That's kind of what a honeypot is. It's just a way of attracting all the traffic over and stopping it dead. We like that. MadPot, don't know why they've called it that, but they have. And they've just kind of gone, here's the tool that we use. Here's the things that we've kind of seen and stopped with it. Here's the intelligence. Here's how a whole bunch of nasty IP addresses that we've got, and so on and so on and so on. And they've spoken about, in this article in particular, another great name, Sandworm, just makes me think of Dune. There we go. Which is tied to a Russian military intelligence unit that was compromising various sort of routers and things to subsume them into routers.
You've gone full American pronunciation today, haven't you? With router.
Well, the thing is, I've got a router, the wood kind, in the cupboard over there. So it's like, okay.
In
yes.
England, that is the only kind, because the other thing is called a router.
Yes, quite. But whatever. And yeah, looking at that botnet, and they managed to take that down entirely because they had, here's all the IP addresses it's coming from, and they can break the whole thing up. So this is interesting. I mean, just for the name, if nothing else. But it's here's a thing that AWS have been kind of using and maintaining internally. Here's what it looks like. Let's talk about it.
And here's some major international intergovernment espionage that it has identified and hopefully helped to prevent. So yeah, interesting stuff. But let's move on to our final article this week, which is also security themed, but somewhat closer to home for your average AWS user. And this is an article on CIO Dive entitled AWS Kicks Off Cloud Race to Mandate MFA by default. MFA, of course, being multi-factor authentication. And if you read any news about AWS, you'll have seen it. I picked this particular article from CIO Dive because it was the first one that I saw, but it's just been everywhere. The whole IT press has been talking about this in the last week or so. So what's so significant about this, John?
Well, there's nothing particularly significant about this as an article because, as you say, it's been kind of doing the rounds. What it's doing is it's doing something that AWS have been doing generally with other things, and it's moving the needle on default security. So they've done this before with not MFA, but with like S3 bucket encryption by default and EBS encryption and those kinds of things, where they've just started, turning things on by default rather than waiting for the customer to go off and do it, because they've moved the needle a little bit. And whilst AWS are responsible for security of the cloud and you're responsible for security in the cloud as the customer, that's where the line is, they seem to be not transgressing, but pushing a little bit into helping you make the correct or more secure decisions in the cloud, just by moving that needle a little bit. What this is doing is it's going to enforce MFA on your root user. Now, that's very important because the root user is functionally God. You basically can't restrict it. It walks all over permission boundaries. The only way you can restrict it is through a service control policy from the organization level. And then even then, you can't apply SCPs to the management account in an organization. So there's still one account in your org that you can't restrict at all with the root user. So yeah, it's good that they're starting to do this. I mean, you've always been able to do it. You've been able to do it for years and years and years because you create an AWS account, you get a root user, that's the first user, and then what they tell you to do is set MFA on it, lock the credentials away, make IAM users, or these days set up an organization and make IAM IDC users, and then never use root again. The only time you need to use root is for a couple of very specific account level things. I think it's just like the account name and the root email, and that's about it. Like even billing, you don't need root user for. You do need it to turn on, allow other people to look at it, because there's a little checkbox that you have to be as root to say, let IAM users look at billing. But once you've done that, you basically don't need the root user anymore. Brilliant. So this is just enforcing part of that process. It's an interesting one though, and I'm just going to talk to it a little bit because whilst it's best practice to make sure that you do have MFA enabled, certainly within the majority of your organization, I would argue that it's best practice to set an SCP to deny the root user from being used. You can't do that in every account, but where you can, MFA should be pointless because you shouldn't be able to use it.
Fair enough. But I guess it's one less best practice check we need to worry about because it's often one of the first things that gets flagged up, isn't it? No MFA on the root user account. The only
concern I've got with this, and it's more of a logistical problem than a concern, I suppose, is when you create an account through AWS organizations, it has a root user because every account has to, but that root user doesn't have a password by default. You have to go and reset the password and then log in and then set MFA and secure the creds away. If you're looking at an organization the size of which like your oil and gas or your banks or whatever will be using, that's tens of thousands of accounts that are going to have to be dealt with by default, where previously you could have just set an SCP and ignored it.
What you mean they're going to have to go through and set up MFA on every single one of those? Yeah.
And it depends on the view that the security team took, whether they go, we will comply with CIS benchmarks, or whether they go, that check's a little bit silly because we've just blocked the user from being used entirely.
Yeah, interesting one. I hadn't thought that. Could create a bit of work for people who've ignored that particular best practice check. Yeah, let's see if we find anyone in that position. But that, unfortunately, brings us to the end of our time for this week. So thank you, as always. I got it in there, John, for your insights.
It's been so long, it stopped being funny now.
I actually keep hearing the word "as always" on pretty much every other radio show and podcast that I listen to. I just kind of, I'm conscious of it. I try not to say it, but I'm just hearing it everywhere. And I kind of think, well, if everyone else says it, then it's okay for me to say it. So.
Was that a presence bias, I think?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Anyway, that does bring us to the end of season 2, episode 36 of Logicast. Why is there a thumbs up appearing on your?
I don't know.
Now, I thought that was a Microsoft Teams feature, but apparently not. It must be a webcam software feature. I don't know. Where is that coming from? I apologize if you're listening to the podcast. You won't be able to see the little thumbs up animation that is appearing on John's screen when he actually puts his thumb up in front of his webcam. So that's one for us to go away and figure out after the podcast. But thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. John has literally made it rain. So if you are listening, I encourage you to go and look at the video version of the podcast on YouTube to see John make it rain at the end of season 2, episode 36 of Logicast. So thanks for listening. We'll be back again next week with more deep dive into the AWS news. We'll see you again next time. Cheers.